Aylin Moreau married Cian Holt believing she had found safety, not knowing that one night would turn her life into a nightmare no one could escape. Cian Holt carried secrets so carefully that even love could not expose them, until the wedding night shattered everything. Serena Vale existed in the shadows, unseen but powerful enough to ignite a chain of destruction. What began as a perfect celebration slowly transformed into silence, suspicion, and a truth too dangerous to ignore. By the time the hotel doors closed, trust was already burning, and there was no way back. This is not a story of love, but of betrayal, silence, and a single moment that changed every life involved. Stay with us, because the next part reveals how one discovery turned a wedding night into a tragedy no one saw coming. Aylin Moreau grew up believing that stability was the greatest form of love. She was not drawn to drama or loud promises. She valued routine, trust, and consistency, qualities shaped by a childhood where uncertainty was common and security was rare. When she met Cian Holt, he appeared to be the opposite of chaos. He was composed, well-spoken, and admired by nearly everyone around him. People described him as reliable, disciplined, and emotionally mature. To Aylin, he felt like safety taking human form. Their relationship moved faster than expected, but it never felt reckless. Cian knew exactly what to say and when to say it. He remembered details, offered reassurance during moments of doubt, and presented himself as someone who believed deeply in commitment. Friends noticed how calm Aylin became after meeting him. Family members saw her confidence grow. From the outside, the relationship looked like a quiet success story in a world full of broken connections. What no one questioned was how carefully Cian controlled the narrative of his life. He avoided deep discussions about his past, always redirecting conversations toward future plans. He kept his phone guarded, not suspiciously, but subtly enough to seem normal. In a society where privacy is often mistaken for maturity, these signs were dismissed as personal boundaries rather than warnings. The engagement came sooner than expected, announced with a polished simplicity that impressed everyone. The wedding planning was efficient and elegant. There were no public disagreements, no visible stress, and no signs of doubt. Aylin believed this calm was proof of compatibility. She had learned to associate peace with love, never imagining that silence could hide deception. On the wedding day, everything appeared flawless. The venue glowed with soft light, guests smiled easily, and the atmosphere carried a sense of order and celebration. Aylin walked with confidence, believing she was stepping into a future built on honesty. Cian stood waiting, calm and collected, presenting the image of a man ready for lifelong commitment. No one noticed the emotional distance behind his controlled expressions. The ceremony ended with applause and celebration. Photographs captured smiles that would later become evidence of illusion. Every detail, from the music to the seating, was perfectly arranged. It was the kind of wedding people described as tasteful and drama-free. In a time when relationships often collapse publicly, this union looked rare and admirable. As the evening progressed, subtle cracks began to form. Cian grew increasingly distracted, often checking the time and separating himself from the crowd under harmless excuses. Aylin sensed a shift but chose to ignore it. Society often teaches people, especially women, to suppress discomfort in moments meant to be happy. She told herself that stress explained everything. The decision to spend the wedding night at a luxury hotel felt symbolic, a private space to begin married life away from noise and expectations. To Aylin, it represented trust and intimacy. To Cian, it was something else entirely, though that truth remained hidden behind calm gestures and practiced behavior. This chapter of the story matters because it shows how danger does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it enters dressed as perfection. In a world driven by appearances, people are taught to admire polished lives without asking what lies beneath. Aylin's story begins not with violence, but with misplaced trust, emotional blindness, and a society that often praises control over honesty. As the night approached and the celebrations faded, the foundation of the marriage rested entirely on belief rather than truth. What followed would expose how fragile that foundation truly was, and how quickly a life built on lies can collapse in a single moment. The wedding ended, the doors closed, and the real story was just beginning. The hotel was quiet in a way that felt intentional, as if sound itself had been instructed to stay away. Soft lights reflected off polished floors, and the air carried the faint scent of cleaning products mixed with expensive perfume. For most couples, this place would have marked the beginning of intimacy and comfort. For Aylin, it became the setting where certainty began to unravel. At first, nothing seemed wrong. Kieran moved through the suite with confidence, placing his belongings with careful order. His behavior appeared calm, almost rehearsed. Aylin noticed how his attention drifted, how his focus never fully settled on the moment they were supposed to share. He appeared present but distant, as if his thoughts were anchored somewhere else. She tried to ignore the growing discomfort. Weddings were exhausting, and stress explained many things. Society often teaches people to justify small unease instead of listening to it. Aylin had learned to silence her instincts in order to maintain peace, especially during moments meant to feel perfect. A minor issue with room service prompted her to step into the hallway. It was a simple interruption, something ordinary and forgettable. As she waited, she noticed unfamiliar sounds from a nearby room, followed by movement that felt strangely out of place for such a private floor. Her attention sharpened, not from suspicion, but from instinct. Aylin did not intend to investigate anything. Curiosity guided her steps, subtle and unplanned. What she encountered instead was undeniable proof of betrayal. Evidence surfaced not through confrontation, but through observation. Small details aligned too perfectly to be coincidence. A name she had never heard before appeared repeatedly, connected to Kieran in ways that could no longer be explained away. The realization struck with physical force. Her breath tightened, her hands trembled, and her thoughts scattered. The man she had trusted had built an entirely separate reality, hidden behind politeness and routine. This was not a mistake or moment of weakness. It was something maintained carefully over time. As the truth settled, memories replayed with new meaning. His guarded phone, his avoidance of the past, his sudden distractions throughout the evening. What once seemed like maturity now revealed itself as control. Aylin understood that the calm she admired was not peace, but concealment. Returning to the suite felt unreal, like walking back into a scene staged for someone else. Every object felt unfamiliar, every detail sharpened by disbelief. The wedding dress, once a symbol of hope, now felt heavy and misplaced. The room that was meant to hold celebration now felt claustrophobic. Aylin's emotions collided all at once. Shock gave way to humiliation, then anger, then something darker and harder to contain. Betrayal does not arrive gently. It strips identity, dignity, and trust in a single moment. The future she had imagined dissolved without warning. This chapter of the story exposes a difficult truth about modern relationships. Deception often survives because it hides behind routine and politeness. People mistake emotional distance for independence and secrecy for privacy. When society normalizes emotional avoidance, betrayal finds space to grow. Aylin stood alone with knowledge she never asked for, burdened by a reality she was unprepared to face. There was no guidance, no pause, and no support in that moment. The silence around her amplified every thought, pushing reason further away with each passing second. What she did not yet understand was how fragile the human mind becomes when trust collapses suddenly. Emotional pain, when ignored or dismissed, can overwhelm judgment. This moment was not just a discovery of infidelity. It was the beginning of a psychological fracture. As the night deepened, Aylin carried the weight of truth back into the room where everything had started. The atmosphere shifted, heavy with unspoken consequences. The choices made next would no longer belong to celebration or tradition, but to raw emotion and irreversible outcomes. The discovery was complete, but the story was far from over. What followed would test the limits of control, reason, and responsibility. Drawing a line between betrayal and tragedy that could never be erased, Aylin returned to the suite, carrying a weight that felt far heavier than her body could hold. The door closed behind her, sealing the room in silence, but her thoughts were louder than anything she had ever known. The space that once represented safety now felt distorted, as if it belonged to a stranger. Every surface reminded her of promises made only hours earlier, promises that had already lost their meaning. Her mind struggled to keep pace with what had happened. Betrayal does not arrive in a straight line. It moves in waves, crashing repeatedly, each time stronger than before. Shock gave way to disbelief, disbelief turned into humiliation, and humiliation slowly transformed into anger. Not the loud kind, but a deep, burning force that settled quietly and refused to leave. Years of emotional restraint surfaced all at once. Aylin had always been taught to remain composed, to avoid conflict, to endure rather than confront. That discipline, praised by society, now worked against her. She had no tools to release what she felt in a healthy way. There was no pause button, no moment to breathe, no voice guiding her back to reason. Kian's presence in the room felt unreal, like part of a scene she no longer recognized. The distance between them was not physical, but emotional, vast and irreversible. Everything she believed about him collapsed into fragments. The future she had imagined only hours earlier no longer existed. In its place was a sense of betrayal so intense that it blurred logic. This was the moment where control began to slip. Emotional overload narrowed her focus, pushing consequences out of reach. When the human mind is overwhelmed, it searches for relief, not solutions. Anger became the only emotion strong enough to overpower the pain beneath it. Rational thought faded as instinct took over. Aylin's actions were not planned. They were driven by impulse, fueled by shock and rage colliding at once. In that moment, she was not thinking about law, morality, or permanence. She was reacting to the collapse of her entire world in a single night. The decision she made lasted only seconds, but its impact would last forever. The fire spread quickly, transforming the suite into chaos. Emergency alarms shattered the silence that had held her captive moments earlier. Reality returned all at once, harsh and unforgiving. Staff rushed in, emergency services followed, and the night that began with celebration turned into a scene of irreversible loss. Kian did not survive. The truth of that outcome settled heavily and instantly. The anger that had driven Aylin moments earlier disappeared, replaced by shock of a different kind. What had felt powerful seconds before now felt hollow and terrifying. There was no sense of victory, only the crushing weight of what could never be undone. Aylin did not attempt to escape. When authorities arrived, she remained still, as if movement itself had lost meaning. The wedding dress she wore became a symbol not of love, but of tragedy. Her hands trembled not from fear of punishment, but from the realization that her life had split into a before and an after, with no path back. This chapter reveals a hard truth about emotional collapse. Violence does not always come from cruelty. Sometimes it grows from untreated pain, suppressed emotions, and a society that fails to teach people how to process betrayal safely. Aylin's actions were wrong, but they were also the result of isolation, shock, and emotional neglect. The fire was extinguished, but the damage remained. Lives were lost, futures erased, and families destroyed. What began as a personal betrayal became a public tragedy, one that would be examined, judged, and remembered for years to come. As dawn approached, the scene was quiet again, but nothing felt peaceful. Aylin was taken away, not as a bride, but as a suspect in a crime that stunned everyone who had celebrated only hours earlier. The world would soon demand answers, but no explanation could change what had already happened. The breaking point had passed. What remained was consequence, investigation, and a story that would force society to confront uncomfortable questions about trust, emotional health, and the cost of silence. The morning light revealed a scene stripped of celebration and filled with consequence. The hotel, once chosen for privacy and elegance, was now sealed off, surrounded by investigators and silent onlookers. What happened inside that suite was no longer a private matter. It had become a case that demanded explanation, structure, and truth. Detective Rowan Pike arrived early, known for approaching complex cases with patience rather than assumption. The first task was to separate emotion from evidence. Every detail mattered. Security footage, access logs, and digital records were collected methodically. The story that began as a wedding now unfolded as a carefully examined timeline. Investigators quickly learned that nothing about Kian Holt's life was as simple as it appeared. His phone records revealed patterns of secrecy stretching back months. Financial transactions showed unexplained expenses, while online activity exposed a hidden connection to Serena Vale. This was not a spontaneous betrayal. It was sustained, deliberate, and concealed behind routine behavior. Hotel staff were interviewed, including Marcus DeWitt, the manager responsible for night operations. Minor procedural lapses came to light, none criminal on their own, but together they revealed how easily private deception could move unnoticed through public systems. A reserved floor, relaxed oversight, and trust in appearances created the conditions where secrecy thrived. Aylin Moreau's mental state became a central focus of the investigation. Medical professionals evaluated her psychological condition, documenting severe emotional distress triggered by sudden betrayal. Reports confirmed that she showed no signs of premeditation. What occurred was an impulsive act driven by emotional collapse, not planning. However, the investigation made one principle clear: understanding is not the same as justification. Detective Pike emphasized that while context explains behavior, it does not erase responsibility. The legal system does not measure pain against consequence. It measures action. As the case progressed, public reaction intensified. Media coverage simplified the story, reducing it to shock and spectacle. Some focused on betrayal, others on punishment. Few addressed the deeper issue of emotional neglect and societal pressure to suppress pain. The truth was more complex than headlines allowed. Serena Vale vanished from public attention, though evidence confirmed her long-term involvement. While her actions contributed to the chain of events, the law could not assign criminal responsibility for the final outcome. This distinction angered many, highlighting how moral guilt and legal guilt rarely align. The investigation exposed how easily deception can exist within socially acceptable behavior. Kian's calm demeanor, praised for years, had protected his secrets. Society often rewards emotional distance, mistaking it for strength. This case challenged that belief, showing how avoidance can hide harm until it becomes irreversible. As evidence was compiled, the narrative became impossible to deny. A wedding built on lies, a betrayal revealed without warning, and a mind pushed beyond its limit. Each factor alone might have ended in heartbreak. Together, they ended in death. Detective Pike closed the investigation with a conclusion that carried no satisfaction. There were no winners, no sense of justice that felt complete. One life was lost, another destroyed, and countless others affected forever. The case would move to court, but the damage was already permanent. This chapter forces an uncomfortable reflection. Systems designed to protect often fail when they rely too heavily on appearances. Relationships collapse when honesty is replaced by performance. Emotional pain becomes dangerous when society refuses to acknowledge it. As the investigation ended, one truth stood clear: tragedy rarely begins with violence. It begins with silence, deception, and ignored warning signs. The legal process would continue, but the larger question remained unanswered. How many similar stories are quietly building around us, hidden behind smiles, routines, and social approval, waiting for a moment that changes everything? The courtroom was silent as the final judgment settled into the public record, but the real weight of the case extended far beyond legal outcomes. Aylin Moreau's life had been permanently divided into two parts: the woman she was before the wedding night and the person she became afterward. The sentence she received reflected accountability under the law, yet no punishment could equal the loss, the regret, or the irreversible damage left behind. Inside prison walls, time moved slowly. Aylin faced long days filled with reflection rather than noise. The anger that once consumed her no longer existed. In its place was a heavy awareness of consequences. What remained was not justification, but understanding of how unchecked emotions, silence, and betrayal combined to create a moment that could never be taken back. Her story became a reminder that emotional pain does not disappear when ignored. It waits, grows, and eventually demands release in ways that can be destructive. Kean Holt's name faded from public praise and became associated only with deception and loss. Those who once admired his discipline now questioned how easily they had accepted distance as maturity. His carefully maintained image collapsed completely, leaving behind a lesson about the danger of living two lives. Deceit, even when hidden behind politeness, does not stay contained forever. The families on both sides carried a different kind of sentence. Grief did not choose a single victim. Parents mourned, relatives endured public scrutiny, and private pain became exposed to strangers. The case proved that when trust breaks violently, the damage spreads far beyond the people directly involved. As media attention faded, the deeper meaning of the tragedy slowly emerged. Experts discussed emotional health, relationship honesty, and the risks of suppressing pain. The story shifted from shock to reflection. Society was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about how emotional neglect is normalized and how people are often left alone during their most fragile moments. This case highlighted a critical challenge of modern life. People are taught how to succeed professionally, how to appear stable, and how to maintain social image, but rarely how to process betrayal, anger, or heartbreak safely. Emotional intelligence is treated as optional, yet its absence can be catastrophic. The lesson is not about excusing violence. Violence destroys everything it touches. The lesson is about prevention. Honest communication, mental health support, and early intervention save lives. Silence and denial do not preserve peace. They quietly build pressure until it explodes. Aylin's actions remain a crime, but her story also serves as a warning. When society praises control over honesty and endurance over expression, it creates conditions where pain becomes dangerous. Betrayal does not justify destruction, but ignoring emotional collapse invites it. Today, this case is studied not for its shock, but for its meaning. It reminds us that trust must be protected, not performed. That relationships built on lies do not simply end, they collapse. That emotional pain deserves attention before it turns into tragedy. The final truth is simple and uncomfortable. One night of deception erased multiple futures. One moment of uncontrolled emotion changed countless lives. This was not a story of love or revenge. It was a story of what happens when honesty is replaced by appearance, and when emotional suffering is left alone in silence. As the documentary ends, the question remains with the viewer. How many warning signs are overlooked every day? How many people are carrying pain without support? And how many tragedies could be prevented if society learned to value emotional truth as much as social image? The story ends, but the lesson must continue.